All right, so for today's video, the motion that we'll be doing is this House believes that economic crises should trigger national elections. All right, so I'm just gonna start the timer right now. Okay, so game. I guess like a few things that you'd immediately see when looking at this motion would be, well, what's a rough definition of an economic crisis? That usually the textbook definition would be like two periods of reverse economic growth, which or economic degrowth, where like there is the definition of a recession, which is 2 quarters of declining GDP. The second would be the definition of a national election or triggering a national election. And I think that the most reasonable interpretation of this would be that a national election would occur, which involves a campaign process, a change in administration, those in the executive and in the main legislative branch of the government. And this would be done nationally. And this would be triggered upon when it is clear that an economic crisis is in place. And I think that this can be akin to when an automatic referendum might be triggered if, for example, enough signatures from the public have been gathered. For example, let's say if there's a survey from the public and they all want to have a referendum on XYZ, this would also be the same type of mechanism that would trigger a national election. All right, so that's pretty fair enough. Reasonable definition of what would happen, when this would happen, and who would institute this, and how it would be instituted. So that's not really much of a problem when making the debate, right? I think the more important thing to think about in prep time here is, okay, now that we're clear in our definition of an economic crisis, now that we're clear in our definition of how this would happen, what are the most important arguments that we would want to prioritize? And of course, this would depend on a lot of the uncertainty that goes on, since there's a lot of different economic crises and there's a lot of different types of states that we're talking about. Like, we're not only talking about the most democratic states, neither are we only talking about like the poorest of states all the time, because even moderate or like medium level democracies can also go through an economic crisis and also require a national election. So it's not populist. It doesn't mean it's conservative. It doesn't mean it's a socialist government. And it also doesn't mean that the government was particularly at fault of an economic crisis. So this is quite important contextualization that we definitely want to say from the very beginning, that this debate is not about a particular context of a government to blame, of a specific economic crisis, or where it may be internally created or externally created, and neither and or of a particular political position that leads to this crisis, that a political position or demographic that experiences this crisis. So this framing and contextualization is quite important, because you want to say that this is a debate on, if this outcome happens, it is necessary to have a national election, and that the second point of contextualization is that the alternative, or the variety of alternatives rather, which is to wait for the next election cycle, or to not have elections at all for a prolonged period during this recovery or during the economic crisis, is much worse. That is the proof that we want to explain here, that it is much worse and it is unjustified. And the third thing we also want to explain at the very beginning of the debate is that no one knows whether or not a new government will always do better or do worse, and neither is the same true for the existing government. Again, because a lot of the factors of an economic crisis are simply out of control, and a lot involve unpredictable factors. So this could involve COVID. It could involve like an economic crisis that stems from another economic crisis from another region, etc., etc. So I think this is quite important to frame at the beginning of the debate, because this allows us to specify what our principle would be. It allows us to specify what our principle would be for this debate. So I would run 3 arguments in this debate. The first argument I would run, and of course I would note that like these are, I'm only able to come up with this now because of the contextualization and because we've narrowed down what the debate is about. Our first argument would necessarily be on the principle, which is or the principle of democracy rather, which is that the public has a right to decide a new government, has a right to decide and express their political preference during an economic crisis. The second argument would be that a national election restores public trust. So this is the domestic argument. And then the third argument would be a national election restores market confidence, which is the international aspect of the debate. I think like right now, when you're listing down these arguments and you're already thinking about what I need to prove, or what's the most difficult part to prove in each argument, or what's the most critical part to prove in each argument, I would just say the following. In the third argument, before we get into that, I know that the argument is going to eventually be about investment. The second argument, I know it's going to be about cooperation and unity between political parties and social and differing social groups. And then the first argument, I think we can already dwell into that immediately. We know that this argument wants to preempt an opposition argument, which is that it's either that the government might be worse, or the government might be bad, or the government might exploit a period of uncertainty and panic with the public. So I think it's quite important to say that no matter what context, right? Political preference and using the information that the public has is the most important thing, because they know their life the most, and that is why we have democracy in the first place. So I think, of course, this argument exists irrespective of the outcome of the election, and irrespective of what policies the public would support during this campaign as a consequence of panic, or as a consequence of genuine change in political belief, which is like there's no clear distinction between this, because knowing that their belief has changed, and inquiring their belief is the most important thing here, that they have a right to have their political belief inquired of, because this is their life, this is the consequence that is going to them, and this is what they simply deserve. And why do they deserve this political preference, or to be inquired? It is because an economic crisis, no matter what, massively changes the lives of people, which is not that difficult to prove, right? We know that an economic crisis may cause unemployment. It may cause significant inflation or hyperinflation. And we also know that an economic crisis involves simply like an entire change in social mindset. Like, how example, COVID, people's priorities changed at a whim. Like their savings decisions changed. People changed their long-term plans because they simply were incapacitated. Their life was totally changed as a consequence of this. And because of this this framing, right? We know that this is something that's easy to prove. We also know that this is a weighing mechanism as to why the argument is important. We now go to the meat of the principle, which is that if we were to stick with the current government and not inquire on the political preference of people, this is wrong, because the conditions of individuals during let's call this normal times, are simply completely different and misaligned with the way in which an economic crisis changes the lives of the public. And so now, I think this is completely brilliant now at this point. Now we've said this is why consent matters. Because they vote for a politician, for their policies, for their campaigns, with the expectation primarily that this is what life would look like. And because an economic crisis is so simply, clearly different in how it changes the entirety of the state, like the entirety of the state, like the hard decisions that governments would need to make with respect to like austerity, which is like changing the government budget, or etc. So it's clear here that now we've demonstrated that consent matters because of this change. They should have a right to vote, right? That is why they have a right to vote, no matter which government would take place, because it is their life, because this life is more important than anything else, and the only means that they have to be able to have recourse against their government is the vote, which is manifested through the control that government has over their entire life. So I think this is a fantastic principle. We've already established the weighing as to why this principle is important, and it's great that you do this at the beginning of the argument. We've already explained why this is uniquely tied to an economic crisis, the nuance of an economic crisis, why it's different from anything else. And we've also explained what the meat of that principle is. What is the main condition as to why it matters? It's because of consent, because of the right to vote. The right to vote is tied to their life and their conditions because it is disrupted because of this economic crisis. And with their framing and contextualization earlier, I think it's fantastic because it's outcome independent. It doesn't depend on the election. It also doesn't depend on particular context. It just means that when an economic crisis happens, these are what guaranteed to happen, and that's why it must be changed as a consequence of this. And it doesn't even matter whether or not it's a change of government. Even voting in the same government is quite important here, because even if they end up voting the same government, the fact that they're able to express how their political preferences have changed and the fact that they get to vote in the first place is more important than anything else in this debate. So of course now that principle is quite clear. We clearly destroy opposition's principle if they wanted to argue that, the government needs to prioritize economic recovery, because of course their idea of economic recovery, the public's idea, is more important than anything else. And now we can actually just debate the actual economic debate, right? The economic debate, which is, does a national election actually worsen the political and economic prospects of the state? And I think that, in fairness, this is not that difficult to disprove or to prove in the first place, right? We know that we want to argue about cooperation and unity as the impact. We just have to explain why, firstly, this is worsened as a consequence of not having a national election. Not having a national election worsens public trust in the following ways. And here are a couple of illustrations that I would just come up with right now, which are not that difficult to come up with in the particular moment, even if we have like 1 minute left. I know that I would want to explain that they would protest whatever they would protest if the government were to behave in a particular way without acquiring their consent, like for example with massive austerity. And then also we know that they would also behave in this way because of the panic and uncertainty that comes from not knowing how the government may behave in the future, which is like the prospect of changing interest rates, etc. So the first reason is just simply, if the government actually does make a change, the people will hate it. And the second reason is, if they don't know what the government will do, and they will always have uncertainty with respect to what the government will do, then they will also be very, very mad. And the clear impact here is that this worsens public trust. That is why it is bad. It's connected to economic recovery, and that is why this argument is important. And then the only thing we've missed in the argument, which of course we'll just need to add how does a campaign process allow for this trust? And then of course I do think opposition would benefit from exploiting this argument, but this is a part of the argument that you can play along with a lot more, because it just involves a lot more illustrations. It involves a process argument, which your deputy can also fill in later on, but we've fulfilled what the minimum of this argument is later as well. And then the third argument, I know that we didn't get to build this within our 15 minutes prep time, but if we don't get to build it, we can pass it on. But if we're able to build it, we also know that the same structure of the second argument would also eventually apply to the third argument, but from an external perspective, which is that if the international community doesn't know what the government is going to do, they will also get very mad. They'll pull out their investments. And this might have happened regardless, but it's worsened if you don't have a national election. And a national election guarantees more international financing, because they also have an incentive for your government to be stabilized in the future, especially if they can cooperate with the next administration, which I think is also definitely a fantastic argument that we can run as well. Okay, so this is basically our evaluation of this particular argument. I'll just go and stop the control here. I think right here now, we know that motions like this require a lot of foresight, but that's only after we clean up what the debate is about. Once we know that the debate is not about a particular new government, like whether it becomes a more extremist government or not, we know that our principle encompasses this, but we know that our argument eventually also supersedes any particular potential outcome as well. Like, even if opposition runs the argument that you will have a very volatile national election campaign process, we know that the alternative is an endemic reality where these sentiments would have otherwise still happened. And we can preempt this because of our pragmatic reasons, which is that we restore public trust, we restore market confidence. We actually, arguably, and our deputy will know this later on, we go towards the center. We actually moderate discussions in the realistic scenario. But even in the worst case scenario, we're also able to address many of these economic consequences too. All right, so hopefully this prep time helped. So thanks everyone for watching, and have a great day.